So today I want to talk about the US electric grid and climate change. In my last video, I talked about how the current issues of elevated temperatures may be influencing and contributing to infrastructure issues such as water mains breaking. I want to now give the US electric grid a similar treatment. There is no doubt, though, that the US electric grid is being pushed to its absolute limits by climate change. This past winter, Texas's independent power grid failed due to the polar vortex, which led to about 700 people dying. This failure was mostly due to the fact that Texas's power grid had no winterization, and the infrastructure was not set up to handle frost from this type of climate change. However, this problem is not isolated, and all forms of extreme weather, including the record-breaking temperatures from this summer's heat, pretty much across the country, are causing huge strains on an aging and failing power grid. To show this off, I want to start off by taking a look at what transpired last week in New York City. So, New York City faced a blackout as extreme heat strained the grid. Thousands of people had seen power outages, and more could be on the way. This is last week on Wednesday afternoon. New Yorkers' phones started shrieking as an emergency alert warned them to conserve power or face the prospect of widespread blackouts. The city, along with parts of the East Coast, were blanketed under an oppressive heat, which was not nearly as much as the West Coast was experiencing. In some areas, Con Edison had been taking extreme measures in an attempt to keep the grid running, as the demand skyrocketed. Now, we have to take into account that the demand is, of course, skyrocketing because due to the high temperatures, there's a much higher desire to have fans, air conditioning, and all sorts of other things to help keep people cool and help keep people hydrated. And so on Wednesday afternoon last week, the utility reduced power voltage by 8% to some neighborhoods in the borough of Queens, while crews worked to repair power equipment affecting some 64,000 customers in more than a dozen neighborhoods. To help manage the heat, the firm also began distributing dry ice at one location in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Dry ice can be hazardous to use in poorly ventilated small spaces, because as it melts, it turns into carbon dioxide gas, which is highly dangerous to breathe in. And so this is really something that ends up affecting people, right? When you have the high temperatures, there's a much higher risk without something to cool people for people to end up in need of medical assistance, and it can be in a lot of ways harmful. So distributing dry ice in order to cool spaces is one option. But if you happen to be in a building with poor ventilation, which New York City and a lot of major cities are kind of known for, that could actually lead to you having to deal with carbon dioxide gas, causing carbon dioxide poisoning. So you're kind of in this catch-22 where do you suffer through it or do you rely on the dry ice? And it's not a good situation to put people in or for people to find themselves in. As a matter of fact, the amount of damage that it can cause to people through hyperthermia and other illnesses that can cause people to become hospitalized can additionally put strains on the system, even if they are small ones. And while this is also a small thing, dry ice is definitely not a long-term solution to all this. Putting more carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere is definitely not going to help it, even in these very trace and small amounts. New York City actually had to urge people to avoid using any sort of intensive appliances like washers, dryers, and microwaves, and definitely limit use of air conditioning. So, all of this said, at a press conference, Mayor Bill de Blasio urged New Yorkers to urgently conserve power and help prevent more blackouts from occurring. He said that Con Edison's president informed him that the widespread power failures could take place Wednesday evening, and thankfully it doesn't seem like they did from what I was able to research. And it says that New Yorkers probably did actually take this at least kind of seriously, in addition to the limiting factor of power voltage by 8%. Now, I don't know if New York has this particular system in play, but some areas of the country have actually taken to utilizing smart devices in people's homes to manually set their thermostats so that they could actually reduce power consumption and avoid rolling blackouts. And this is the type of environment that we're in with this combination of high heat and the electrical grid potentially failing. I also want to remind people that if electric grids fail, it can also lead to a lot of food spoilage, in an economy where a lot of people are struggling to maintain their supplies of food, that food supply will not be replaced, and it can have economic factors in people's lives, especially if the refrigerator, of all things, goes down. The current electric grid does nothing for that, and that is really a problem. Not to mention other forms of waste that might occur, and like I said before, illness. Numerous temperature records were toppled in New York and the surrounding areas on Wednesday. LaGuardia saw temperatures in the 100-degree plus range, 102 plus range in Newark. Boston had over 100-degree temperatures, and they weren't even as bad as the temperatures in the Pacific Northwest, which we will jump to in a moment. The New York grid's incapability to withstand the current heat wave is the latest sign that the city's energy system is in rough shape. The outages come less than a year after the relatively mild Hurricane Isaiah left thousands of people without power for days, which is, of course, another form of extreme weather that is affecting things. New York is getting more hurricanes, and the Northeast in general is getting stronger and more powerful hurricanes, and the southwest of the United States, down also into Puerto Rico, are getting more intense hurricanes. And that is, of course, affecting the entire Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The New York grid also had a broken connection in July of 2019, where key pieces of equipment were actually failed, and it plunged the city into darkness. And it's not just New York City, the electric grid there that is failing. It is actually part of a much larger issue where most of the United States is not set to deal with this climate. In fact, when we go to look at Oregon, for example, they found that under the heat dome that happened in the Pacific Northwest, that power cables made of copper were literally starting to melt, such that Portland streetcars, due to these temperatures in the 110, 120-degree range, actually made it so that they had to shut down streetcars, and that the light rail system with copper overhead wires sagged. And this is actually absurd, but it actually happened. And this is just another area. California's had rolling blackouts, and Texas has had massive movements to tell people not to use their air conditioners or to limit ACs. And this has just been across the country a wide issue that has been going on. And what were once 100 or 1,000 year heat waves, once in 100 years or once in 1,000-year heat waves, that these floods and storms and hurricanes are now becoming more common. And the extreme weather in not just the Northwest, but the entire country is causing damage and is really representing the underfunded and underappreciated infrastructure that's in the country. In this case, in this article, they're talking about the transportation network, but that does tie to the power grid in this case, especially with the light rail and the streetcar systems. Now, I just want to take a moment and also talk about the fact that when we look at all this, there's going to also be a higher reliance for people on water systems. We need to keep ourselves hydrated when power goes out. And that's something that's really relevant and important, because when we look at how power plants function and the fact that water is required to keep them cooled, we find that we are starting to run into an issue where water is not able to do its job because we are starting to run out of it. And if that power cable melting should be any sign of anything with the infrastructure failing, this all really does tie back to the energy grid itself and how we're producing energy and the fact that it needs to be cooled. So more demand and less supply, the drought and heat test, the U.S. power grid. The scorching temperatures and the drought pummeling the western United States and creating a perfect storm for the electrical grid is exposing how future extreme weather events will increasingly push a thinly stretched power system to the brink. As Oregon, California, and New Mexico and other states grapple with record-setting heat and diminishing water supplies, Americans are relying even more on electricity and water supply systems. Yet the same factors that are driving up demand for power can also limit the ability to generate it. From generation at power plants to the transmission lines that carry electricity to homes and businesses, just about every part of the power system performs worse in conditions that are intensely hot. So yeah, like with the power line that started melting, that's one example of it, the damage that can be caused. But in addition to it, a lot of this runs less efficiently. As a matter of fact, in order to keep some of their power equipment cool, Portland actually had to use systems, cooling systems, to keep all of the temperatures down. And they themselves use electricity. If anybody is aware of that, it's quite an inefficient system. If you leave your refrigerator door open, for example, you actually generate more heat in your space. The area immediately in front of a refrigerator, ends up becoming cooler, but it generates more heat as it tries to cool down the rest of your apartment or your house. So basically, you end up generating more heat. And so that's kind of what's happening in Portland when they have to use cooling systems. You have to generate more electricity, which is going to have to disperse that heat somewhere, usually outside, through an air conditioning system that is then going to help cool the system that is then heating up because of that, which will generally heat it more. And unfortunately, that's what they had to do to maintain their system due to what's going on. As more and more people in Oregon are buying air conditioners, and air conditioners really are one of the big factors. As we'll talk about very briefly, these temperatures are getting to a point where humans can't necessarily function well in them. And so buying this is becoming more and more of a requirement. The severe drought that's plaguing huge swaths of the West, with lake levels dropping and riverbeds drying up, poses another challenge to keeping power on for Americans. Fuel-burning power plants such as coal, natural gas, and even nuclear plants often rely on water systems to cool their structures down. The less water nearby or available to be pumped from elsewhere, the less power those plants can safely guarantee, according to energy analysts. A water shortage can even take a power plant offline. So if you have a water shortage and a drought that is being caused by climate change, and then you have increased temperatures, which are putting damage on the infrastructure and the system, you now have two different things hitting the electric grid at the same time and potentially causing power plants to stop. And there's actually an article put out by Carbon Brief by two doctors, Ethan Koffel and Justin Mankin, that talk about how the coal, gas, and nuclear power plants that generate the most of the electricity could actually have an issue due to cooling because they need water to function properly. Waste heat from these facilities is typically released into the atmosphere or nearby water sources. During heat waves or droughts, excessive heat or lack of water makes it much harder for the plants to keep cool. Now, that's the thing. When you're trying to generate power during the non-summer months or when it's not really that hot out, you can put some of that heat out into the atmosphere. And that really doesn't do all that much. But if you don't have that, water is literally the only place you can dump all that heat into. And if you don't have that, you can't run power plants. When this happens, the plants must be curbed, meaning electricity output is cut. This often comes as electricity demand peaks due to people's reliance on air conditioning to keep cool. These plants are usually located along rivers, as we saw, and on the hottest days, some of the plants have had their output curbed and entirely shut down, and this even happened in power plants in France and Germany during their 2019 heat waves. So this isn't even just happening in the US, it's happening pretty much across at least the northern hemisphere, but certainly across the world. I think either earlier this year or last year, there were even record-breaking temperatures in parts of Siberia as well, which is, of course, known for it being cold and snowy. And that's what we're dealing with at this time. Temperatures rising and heat waves becoming more frequent in some regions, these conditions are already approaching the limits of human tolerance. And this is actually based off of a study that was done that talks about how these higher temperatures are actually putting people in a place where they can't actually tolerate some of these temperatures. And it's causing dangerous conditions. And ACs, like I said before, are one of the only ways that people in, at the very least, richer countries can afford to deal with the dangerously hot weather conditions. And so the reliance is, of course, on the AC, which increases the power grid's consumption and moves us into this very cyclical process where higher temperatures lead to needing more AC. Then that puts more strain on the electric grid, which therefore can't function as well because we don't have access to putting the high temperatures out into the air. And of course, the higher the temperature, the more you need to cool. So if we're dealing with 150 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, then that's going to make it significantly harder to cool than areas if they maybe got a heat wave of 100 to 105. So that really does need to be considered. And that's not even factoring in other temperature-based or other extreme weather things that might occur, maybe hurricanes, for example, that might cause infrastructure damage just from the sheer wind force. So this electrical supply gap means that society will likely have to have less power to run air conditioners during future heat waves, which of course increases risk of illness, like I talked about before. In a scenario where thermal power generation is mostly phased out, replaced with renewables by the end of the century, we might actually see it so that the global restrictions on hot days could be cut by more than 50% of today's levels, despite a greater number of heat waves. In contrast, however, if thermal power generation increases in the future, as shown by the red line on this marker, we might find that restrictions might have to triple from today's levels. And the restrictions mean things like rolling blackouts and preventing people from getting access to the grid for periods of time or mandating certain temperatures from people. This is the reality that we're looking at in the future. And the problem is there's a fear that a lot of companies and a lot of people will double down and they'll start going into building more of the same type of plants, which will just increase the amount of damage to the atmosphere, which will cause long-term effects that will just produce this cyclically and continue moving forward. Renewables needs to be the direction that we go in. I believe it should be apparent at this point that the current infrastructure and our current systems cannot function in these high temperatures, nor with other severe weather that we're experiencing due to climate change. We literally have parts of the US considering all these things like rolling blackouts, asking customers to not use electricity, power lines melting, smart technology being utilized in homes to manually control what temperature people can put their thermostats at. And we have power plants that do not function well as temperatures get higher. The fear is that we're going to double down on all this and it's going to lead to more issues moving forward. Within the United States, it needs to be recognized that the electric grid is largely shared. There's the East grid, the West grid, and the Texas grid. And so for large parts of the country, the infrastructure is very much shared. And when we try to draw power during times of crisis, such as a heat wave or a storm or anything else, during hard times in general, the electric grid relies on the other parts of the grid to supplement what they can't produce themselves. So given that, we do all rely on each other in the United States to draw power from each other. So a failure of infrastructure in one area certainly influences and causes potential harm in other areas. And when we look at the economic factors and who controls the electric grid, it's regulated and controlled by nearly different areas and different parts of the country with mixes of private and public and hybrid models where nothing is really coordinated in a way that might be necessary. And in all of this, our current system really does need to start changing, and we need to start moving at the very least into the direction of renewable energy sources, especially wind and solar energy. And we need to keep all of that in mind as we rely on each other moving forward. If we maintain all of this and we actively switch in the direction of renewable energy, I think one of the ways to also fix this is to start switching to a decentralized model, such as maybe a microgrid model, where a lot of places can have their own solar sources and backup generators and power sources that would kick in during a crisis, and potentially even be able to give back to the grid in cases of emergencies. Shifting in that direction and taking climate change seriously may be the only way to make this work. Unfortunately, it does need to be recognized that a lot of the companies involved and a lot of the private interests involved don't necessarily want to change the status quo because it benefits them financially right now. And so it's yet another inefficiency of capitalism that we're finding that a lot of these companies, in terms of privatizing the electric grid, are making it more dangerous for people in the long run. Yeah, it might mean temporary lower prices now, but it's going to mean much more dangerous externalities and long-term costs in the future. So if we're going to solve this, we need to take on this massive challenge, and we really need to consider the infrastructure as these temperatures continue to rise and other events start to affect us. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord, where we have a lot of great and lovely conversations talking about all sorts of things like this. With that said, my name is Anarchist Terra, and I thank you for watching.